Good day, everybody. You are tuned into Cragcore. It's been a while since I posted any videos. But you know what? Every now and then we need a break, don't we? So, basically, I feel like at the minute it's worth just basically pointing out that it's the 18th of July 2021. Now, on the 19th here in the UK, that's tomorrow, all these restrictions and stuff are supposedly going to be lifted. Now, there's mixed feelings about that. I don't see how or why there would be people that still want to continue this nightmare, but there are. Funnily enough, there are. I think it's worth analysing, okay, because, everybody's actions affects everybody. We all seem to think that, well, some of us seem to think that we're all in this together and we need to kind of do what's correct for the greater good of mankind, considering that the whole of mankind is actually, a part of this and suffering and being affected by it. But I think the majority of folks have that belief, but basically use that belief as a justification for being selfish. And the reason they're being selfish is because of the fear that has been drilled into them that they are now making their decisions based upon, in my opinion. And you know what? I mean, it's not okay, is it? But understanding that does in some way alleviate some of the anger, I suppose, that could be felt towards those people. Because if somebody acts in fear, then fear shuts off rational thought. So people aren't going to be thinking rationally, therefore they can't really be blamed, in effect, for making irrational decisions, especially when that fear is being imposed upon the people from an outside force, such as the government, fueled by certain medical establishments. So I don't bear a grudge, at least not yet. I still feel as though there is time to turn this whole situation around. Unfortunately, I also believe that the brainwashing that has been induced through the fear has quite possibly taken too tight of a hold over certain people's mental states, to the point where it's probably gone past a point of no return. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that I'm wrong. I really, really do hope that I'm wrong. I mean, I suppose after tomorrow, what we're going to find out is whether or not I'm right about that. Because tomorrow we will see restrictions lifted. If that happens at all, I'm skeptical. We'll come to the reasons why I'm skeptical. But we see restrictions lifted. And what does that mean? Well, it means, if you've read the government announcement, if you've read what Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, has actually said, it is that he will lift the restrictions for social distancing and he will lift the restrictions for face coverings. However, they recommend and expect people to still continue wearing face coverings in public spaces where they aren't necessarily going to be where they're going to be with people they wouldn't usually be with, basically, so strangers. So based on that, it's actually no different from what has previously been stated. However, the legal term has been lifted, but they've still asked you to do it, which means an awful lot of people are still feeling as though there is something that requires fear, and fear enough to actually do these things. Now, common sense needs to come in here, because I've looked up a few things regarding the sizes of these particular viral particles and spores. Let's just say, without getting into specifics, if you yourselves type into Google search virus spores size and pollen spores size in what's the term I used? Microns. So size in microns for pollen and viral spores. Now, you will then, I mean, I don't want to get into specifics here because it's specifics that can be used as a way to, you know, bring about a video being taken down. So the best way to do it is to be non-specific, and just urge every single one of you just to go and do your own research into these things, because as it shows, the pollen spores are in fact 10 times greater, or at least a lot larger than the virus spores, which alludes to the fact that if you're able to have hay fever symptoms through wearing a face covering, say for instance you get the scratchy roof of the mouth, you get a bit of a hoarse throat and what have you, if that's the case and these face coverings are allowing these spores through, well, they're actually not going to be doing anything then, are they, in the ways of stopping smaller particles through either? I mean, that is surely common sense. So, ultimately, when we look at this type of common sense evidence, you then have to ask yourself whether or not it would be worth wearing these things at all. And in that respect, if somebody like myself, with a basic YouTube search, is able to find this information, then you can guarantee that somebody working for an extremely large medical company is extremely privy to this information too. So that means these same companies, these same organisations that are giving the advice to the governments would know this, which means the governments would know this. So why then is it a requirement? Especially when it became a requirement after the apparent largest spell of cases and infections and stuff. That in itself makes you feel as though there's something a little bit strange about that decision. You know, surely you would say, okay then, since we know nothing about this, we're just going to impose all the rules to begin with and then slowly trickle them out. But instead, a lot of these rules came in at times where it seemed very confusing, at the very least. Well, you see, I made a video this time last year surrounding the subject that a lot of these measures were put in place to simply keep the fear going. Because if you keep a population under the cosh of fear, they are extremely easy to control and manipulate. Any group of people. In fact, it's even easier when it's a group of people, because then you get group panic. And group panic means that it spreads like wildfire, and as a group, people tend to think symbiotically and collectively. Their thoughts aren't necessarily their own, they're coming from the group itself. So that it then becomes this living organism within itself. And nobody then thinks for themselves. So it's so long as you can get a large group of people to be afeared, then you start imposing instructions on a few of them, the whole group then follows suit. It's a bit like when you see a school of fish. One fish will move this way, and because of the fluctuations in the currents in the water and stuff, that then becomes an effect that is instantaneous, almost, for the rest of the school of fish to move in that particular direction until another one will move in the opposite direction, so on and so forth. And that's how they all move as one being, one particular, like a massive structure of one, when it's made up of all these different fish. Now, we could go into many different examples here, but we don't want to lose track. So keeping the fear going, then you can see that then this is a very important tactic for people, should these people be trying to impose nefarious acts and what have yous upon a population. Nefarious tactics, nefarious agendas on a group of people, i.e. the population of planet Earth. Because make no mistake, this is global. We've seen that this is global because it's a global thing. I think it's safe at this point to assume that our governments do not actually work separate from one another. They are quite likely to be working in tandem with one another for a greater mission. So just going back to where we was pointing out the need for the fear to continue. Well, we see now we've pointed that out, we can see now why it would be advantageous, at least, to this type of tactic, that a visual representation, considering that it's quite possibly the only representation that anything is still going on in the world. When you consider that cases are simply cases, cases require a positive test. And a positive test doesn't mean anything unless you factor in all the other aspects, such as, was it a hospitalization? Was it symptomatic for a start? Was it a hospitalization? Did that hospitalization turn into a severe case? Did that severe case then turn into a death? You have to ask, at what point along this path, along this cycle of events, did it stop? Because if it stopped at symptomatic and it remained non-symptomatic, well then it's irrelevant. If it stops at it goes past symptomatic and it turns into, an isolation case at home where you're bedridden and you've got symptoms and you feel poorly and you have to, not do anything for a few days. Well, it's irrelevant because you came through it and now you're healthy again. Just like catching any other virus. If you get symptoms and you're poorly for a few days and then you come out of it, did it matter? No. It only matters, in my opinion, whether it reaches the point of a hospitalization that becomes a severe case. Because at this point you've reached a level that could potentially put strain on the NHS, which, let's not forget, is the reason why all of this began, was because you had to protect the NHS by not allowing the cases to reach such a degree that it was putting strain on the NHS. So at that point, when it becomes a severe case, then you have to take into consideration whether or not these things are in the greatest of numbers relevant, that would be needed to impose restrictions on a whole society of people. If the answer to that question is yes, well, then you have to then start taking measures. But if the answer to that question is no, then you really have to then start questioning the need for any restrictions whatsoever. If it reaches the point where the deaths directly from, not just a matter of time after a positive test, because let's remember, a positive test means nothing unless you go through these steps and it reaches that ultimate stage. So if you die as a direct result of this virus, then fair enough. It should be counted as a death from the virus, but you cannot humanely impede a whole society and impose restrictions upon that society based on a death that happens for any reason within a certain amount of time after a positive test, when you consider then the positive test actually means nothing unless you factor in the correct steps and where it led to. Because I reiterate, if a positive test comes back and a person remains asymptomatic, or should I say unsymptomatic, then what, number one, is the point for isolation? Number two, what is the point in even reporting that as something that needs to be worried about? Because there's a lot of talk about the asymptomatic spread. Now, in my opinion, that seems to be extremely convenient, because that way they've got you if you do and they've got you if you don't. And in my opinion, the way these people work is to cover all bases in order to just ensure that no matter what happens, they've got the upper hand. You have to take into consideration that the tests themselves are being tested by the same people and the same organizations as the people that benefit from the mayhem continuing. So it serves in their benefit then to have positive tests. Nobody knows whether or not their test is actually positive if they remain unsymptomatic. How many people have you heard about that have said, "Oh, I didn't even know I had it. It didn't affect me. And people in my household, they all did tests and they didn't get it." Well, you see, what this alludes to is the whole fact that the notion that asymptomatic spread is quite obviously a fallacy, in my opinion, because I remember watching a news interview with one of the upper echelon inner circle politicians recently. I can't remember which particular one it was. It may have been Chris Whitty, it may have been Dominic Raab, it may have been Matt Hancock. I can't remember which one it was. But it was one of those inner circle elite politicians. And he stated that because he was being questioned on the effectiveness of this vaccine that is being used to fight it. And they said, there are reports of people still catching this when they've been vaccinated. And he, I suppose, was backed into a corner to some degree, because he let slip that it doesn't stop you. I mean, whether he let slip or not, this may just be what he wanted to say, whether or not he was forced into it. But he said clearly and plainly that it doesn't stop you contracting or passing on. The way that what it does, the way it slows the spread of the virus, is it slows the symptoms within you, thus alluding to the fact that it's the symptoms themselves that pass it on. Because if all it does is stop the symptoms, within a certain percentage, let's just say, for argument's sake, no, in fact, I'm not even going to give a percentage, because, again, it's best to be as non-specific as possible. But if all it does is slow down the symptoms, and that's how it slows the spread, well, then you have to take from that it's the symptoms themselves that therefore spread the virus. So, asymptomatic spread, what's that? Because if you haven't got any symptoms whatsoever, it strikes me as being blatantly obvious then that if you haven't got enough of something within you to make you actually sick and present symptoms, then how can you then pass it on easily? I'm not saying you can't pass it on, but how can you pass it on easily with any kind of threat and danger to other people? Because if this was like I've said, we're not saying here that you can't pass it on if you're asymptomatic or unsymptomatic. But what that alludes to is it would be extremely difficult to pass it on. So, therefore, is the threat of that the unsymptomatic spread? Is the threat of that worthy of imposing life-impeding restrictions on a whole population? I dare say no, it isn't. I don't think that, based on the fact you see a lot of people saying they have no symptoms, they've isolated with their family have also done tests, and there was members of their family in their household that they'd been in contact with. In some cases, it's intimate partners, and the other side of the partnership, even they were still having intimate relationship throughout this whole process, didn't have a positive test. Well, you have to then say that's either the symptoms and the asymptomatic spread is non-existent, or the test itself that the other person took was untrustworthy. Either way, it throws up questions, and question enough to cast doubt on the whole situation, the whole scenario, and the whole process of how this thing is being managed. When you are sick, let's just say, for instance, you've got a cough related to something like the common cold. The way that the virus works is it gets into your body and then it mutates. When it mutates to it doesn't mutate, it multiplies. When it multiplies to a level where it's able to have enough of its number within you, it then starts making you feel sick, because it's now starting to take over the body. So that's when it's multiplied to a certain point. As your immune system starts to fight it, this is why they say the cough doesn't come until later on in the virus, because it's clever, you see. Once your immune system starts to fight whatever it is that you've caught, it needs to now get out so it can continue to live. And how is it going to get out of your body? Well, it starts to create a cough. So when you're coughing or sneezing or whatever it is that it's making happen, it's able to expel itself from your body so it can land out there on different things. It can go in the wind, it can splatter on people's faces, and that's how it then gets into another host. So this basically shows that the symptoms themselves are, a vast majority of the time, the only thing that can necessarily spread something. So the wearing of face coverings and the whole notion of antisocial distancing to stop things like the unsymptomatic spread of a virus is absolutely preposterous. And people use this as a justification, and they're not willing to use their common sense to look at the situation properly with a questioning mind, and to use their critical thinking and common sense, which is turning out to be less and less common, might I add. Sense. And instead of using those very important things that we all possess, a lot of people are choosing to hand that over to the box in the corner of the room called the television, which is telling people to believe something that goes against what people's common sense would actually tell them should they actually use it. And this is the greatest crime against humanity that is happening right now. Yes, the governments and these medical companies are, these institutions are at the spearhead of this, funneling this out through the television sets, through all their propaganda and their marketing schemes. And let's not forget, an actual deadly pandemic wouldn't need a marketing scheme. It's its own marketing scheme, given the fact it's killing everybody. But if that's not happening, well, then people need to stand in, don't they? If they want to try and weaponize the threat of a pandemic. So, ultimately, given all of these factors, we have to now accept that the people themselves being willing enough to just give away the human rights and freedoms of the people based on their unwillingness to actually use common sense, and handing that over for the easy route, which is quite simply being told what to do and what to think, is a massive crime against the rest of the world. Because so long as you keep those people in the majority, the rest of the world hasn't really got a leg to stand on, and hasn't really got a chance in hell of turning things around. So this is why I implore every single one of you to ask questions. Just go on Google and ask a simple question. Take the time, take the 10 seconds that it would take to type a question into Google. If you don't know, ask the question, instead of quite simply being told. Now, you see, I did this earlier on. I did this, I basically asked about the mutations and how viruses mutate. Because there seems to be an awful lot of convenient mutations happening and variants happening at the minute. Just around the times, you know, when the restrictions are supposedly going to be lifted, which, again, based on these very, very convenient aspects, I doubt the restrictions will be lifted at all. But we can still live in hope, can't we? But I did ask Google how viruses mutate. Now, it took me, I think it was 6 or 7 pages. Now, I didn't specifically ask for any specific virus. I just asked how viruses mutate. And it took me 6 or 7 pages to reach an article that wasn't related to the current state of what's going on in the world right now. Now, in my opinion, if you know how the internet works and how search engines work, it's all algorithmic. It's all to do with the algorithms and stuff like that. Now, these algorithms are set up in such a way to benefit certain things so that other things aren't benefited whatsoever. So, given that it's mathematics and stuff like this, you would have to start to assume that it's by design. That if you ask that very simple question that doesn't necessarily specify anything in particular, it must be then by design, or at least you have to suspect that it's by design that every piece of information that comes up is about one specific virus. You have to suspect that. I was a bit annoyed, you know, quite honestly, because I was like, well, I don't want to read about this. I want to read about something in general. Because if you think about it, the stuff that's going on right now, if you look at it from the aspect that it is a weaponization of a situation in order to impose more and more restrictions on the population of the Earth, taking away more rights and free will, you have to accept that this is happening. So let's just say that that is the agenda and it's not just happening by chance. One would have to assume then that it is part of an agenda, given that people in power do have a choice. You then have to think, well, it would suit said agenda, said probable, possible agenda, alleged agenda. It would suit that the information surrounding the subject that's actually fulfilling the agenda for them, it would then suit that then to be doctored information, controlled information, spun in a certain way to give certain bits of information and leave other bits out, which allude to crowd control. So if anybody ever looks for any information, all they find is information based on that subject. They get sick and tired of sifting through all of these, so they end up stopping or just looking at one piece of information they've been given, and then just literally getting the information that they are, you know, needed to have based on the fact that they are now a controlled source. This is obviously speculation, but one has to wonder, don't they? I mean, we have to wonder, we have to ask these questions. Once you start looking into all of this, you're either going to be invigorated because you realise that you're at the bottom of a very large mountain with an awful lot to learn in order to try and reach the summit, or you're going to go mad. It's as simple as that, because there's an awful lot of pressure involved in the responsibility that one has to undertake when faced with such a situation. Now, people can thrive under pressure, under the pressure of responsibility, and other people will buckle. But it is up to all of us as individuals to at least try. At the very least, to try. And by try, What I mean is to try and see what is going on, to just dare to look into the darkness at what it is that's being hidden. And just try and see the situation for what it is, which in my opinion is a huge global scam. And I'm not just talking about the situation that's going on right now. I believe that this situation that's going on right now could potentially be positive, considering the fact it's waking an awful lot of people up to the massive global scam that's been going on for millennia. So it could all be what is necessary. Now, I'm going to end on this point. And I'd just like to reiterate, I do believe there is a great global scam that's been happening for millennia. You look at any of this stuff and, you know, you look at it for any period of time and it will show you all the dots do connect to a massive global scam. We could go into a lot of those things, but it would take another very long video. But on a positive note, I'm going to end on this. Metaphorically speaking, if you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes and the sun is shining through, it takes a while for your eyes to adjust to the light, doesn't it? And it's almost painful at times when you open your eyes and it's really bright and you've just been asleep. It can be quite painful. Well, you see, that representatively is what is probably going on in the world right now. The world, in my opinion, is going through a great wake-up. People are starting to open their eyes to the bullshit. Any change in collective consciousness is always going to be painful, because opening your eyes from the darkness into the light is painful physically. So you imagine how that is going to feel when you have your awareness taken from the darkness into the light, considering the fact that your awareness is all that you are. So now you're not just feeling pain in your eyes. Metaphorically, you're actually feeling pain in all that you are. But the pain is a necessary aspect of the schism that is taking place. And I truly believe that all of this is for the greater good of mankind. And if we can just hold fast, if we can just maintain and fight for ourselves and do the work on ourselves to educate ourselves and to be a better person, then we will propel and project our whole civilization into a new state of being, a new state of universal enlightened consciousness. I truly believe that it doesn't take an awful lot of people to start the ball rolling. I was listening to a video by a guy called Ken Wilber, and he said it only usually takes around 10% of the Earth's population to start a collective consciousness shift. Now, he says we're somewhere around 7%. I don't know where he got that number from, but we're not that far off. So if we start to do the work on ourselves and we be a better person so the world itself can be a better place, that's all it takes. You might be the one that is able to just tip the scales in the right direction. You could be the last person that just needs to change. Think of it that way, rather than this defeatist mentality of little old me, what can I do? Now, this is Cragcore. I'm going to sign off here. I'm going to thank you extremely for from the bottom of my heart for staying focused and for continuing to watch this video to this point. 40 minutes is a long time. I've been talking at this camera for a very long time. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you to all the new subscribers. I've picked up quite a few just lately. Thank you for the comments on the videos. I thoroughly appreciate it. And let's continue on our fight into the positive future that I'm sure we all are going to live within. So I'm going to wish love and peace to all things everywhere. And this is Crack Course signing off. Peace.